Welcome back to another episode of Mike Reads. Today we'll be continuing in our series in Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson with Chapter 4, which is entitled Public Works Means Taxes. We're doing this, as I've mentioned in previous reads, as a parallel read with Thomas Sowell's Economic Facts and Fallacies, so I'll post a link in this video's description to that series as well. As I've mentioned in previous reads in this series, I've already read Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson, so I'll post a link in the description as well to my review of the book. And as I've also mentioned in previous reads, we'll be conducting an analysis and review at the end of each read so that the viewers at home can get a better understanding of both the read itself and how I've interpreted the read. In this case, Chapter 4 is also broken up before we get started into 3 subsections. He hasn't titled the subsections, so I probably won't break that up in the timestamps for this video, especially given that subsection 1 is just the opening of the chapter. So without further ado, let's dive right on into Chapter 4, Public Works Mean Taxes. There is no more persistent and influential faith in the world today than the faith in government spending. Everywhere, government spending is presented as a panacea for all our economic ills. Is private industry partially stagnant? We can fix it all by government spending. Is there unemployment? That is obviously due to quote-unquote insufficient private purchasing power. The remedy is just as obvious. All that is necessary for the government to spend enough to make up the quote-unquote deficiency. An enormous literature is based on this fallacy, and, as so often happens with doctrines of this sort, it has become part of an intricate network of fallacies that mutually support each other. We cannot explore the whole network at this point. We shall return to other branches of it later. But we can examine here the mother fallacy that has given birth to this progeny, the main stem of the network. Everything we get, outside of the free gifts of nature, must in some way be paid for. The world is full of so-called economists who in turn are full of schemes for getting something for nothing. They tell us that the government can spend and spend without taxing at all, that it can continue to pile up debt without ever paying it off because we owe it to ourselves. We shall return to such extraordinary doctrines at a later point. Here I am afraid that we shall have to be dogmatic and point out that such pleasant dreams in the past have always been shattered by national insolvency or a runaway inflation. Here we shall have to simply say that all government expenditures must eventually be paid out of the proceeds of taxation, that inflation itself is merely a form, and a particularly vicious form, of taxation. Having put aside for later consideration the network of fallacies, which rest on chronic government borrowing and inflation, we shall take it for granted throughout the present chapter that either immediately or ultimately every dollar of government spending must be raised through a dollar of taxation. Once we look at the matter in this way, the supposed miracles of government spending will appear in another light. A certain amount of public spending is necessary to perform essential government functions. A certain amount of public works, of streets and roads and bridges and tunnels, of armories and navy yards, of buildings to house legislatures, police, and fire departments, is necessary to supply essential public services. With such public works, necessary for their own sake, and defended on that ground alone, I am not here concerned. I am here concerned with the public works considered as a means of quote-unquote providing employment, or of adding wealth to the community that it would not otherwise have had. A bridge is built. If it is built to meet an insistent public demand, if it solves a traffic problem or a transportation problem otherwise insoluble, if, in short, it is even more necessary to the taxpayers collectively than the things for which they would have individually spent their money if it had not been taxed away from them, there can be no objection. But a bridge built primarily, quote-unquote, to provide employment, is a different kind of bridge. When providing employment becomes the end, need becomes a subordinate consideration. Projects have to be invented. Instead of thinking only of where bridges must be built, the government spenders begin to ask themselves where bridges can be built. Can they think of plausible reasons why an additional bridge should connect Easton and Weston? It soon becomes absolutely essential. Those who doubt the necessity are dismissed as obstructionists and reactionaries. Two arguments are put forward for the bridge, one of which is mainly heard before it is built, the other of which is mainly heard after it has been completed. The first argument is that it will provide employment. It will provide, say, 500 jobs for a year. The implication is that these are jobs that would not otherwise have come into existence. This is what is immediately seen. But if we had trained ourselves to look beyond immediate to secondary consequences, and beyond those who are directly benefited by a government project to others who are indirectly affected, a different picture presents itself. It is true that a particular group of bridge workers may receive more employment than otherwise, but the bridge has to be paid for out of our taxes. For every dollar that is spent on the bridge, a dollar will be taken away from taxpayers. If the bridge costs $10 million, the taxpayers will lose $10 million. They will have that much taken away from them, which would otherwise have spent, They will have that much taken away from them, which they would otherwise have spent on the things they needed most. Therefore, every public job created by the bridge project, a private job, has been destroyed somewhere else. We can see the men employed on the bridge. We can watch them at work. The employment argument of the government spenders becomes vivid and probably for most people convincing. But there are others that we do not see because, alas, they have never been permitted to come into existence. They are the jobs destroyed by the $10 million taken from the taxpayers. All that has happened at best is that there has been a diversion of jobs because of the project. More bridge builders, fewer automobile workers, television technicians, clothing workers, and farmers. But then we come to the second argument. The bridge exists. It is, let us suppose, a beautiful and not an ugly bridge. It has come into being through the magic of government spending. Where would it have been if the obstructionists and reactionaries had had their way? There would have been no bridge. The country would have been just that much poorer. Here again, the government spenders have the better of the argument with all those who cannot see beyond the immediate range of their physical eyes. They can see the bridge. But if they have taught themselves to look for indirect as well as direct consequences, they can once more see in the eye of imagination the possibilities that have never been allowed to come into existence. They can see the unbuilt homes, the unmade cars and washing machines, the unmade dresses and coats, perhaps the ungrown and unsold foodstuffs. To see these uncreated things requires a kind of imagination that not many people have. We can think of these non-existent objects once, perhaps, but we cannot keep them before our minds as we can the bridge that we pass every working day. What has happened is merely that one thing has been created instead of others. The same reasoning applies, of course, to every other form of public work. It applies just as well, for example, to the erection with public funds of housing for people of low incomes. All that happens is that money is taken away through taxes from families of higher income, and perhaps a little from families of even lower income, to force them to subsidize these selected families with low incomes and enable them to live in better housing for the same rent or for lower rent than previously. I do not intend to enter here into all the pros and cons of public housing. I am concerned only to point out the error in two of the arguments most frequently put forward in favor of public housing. One is the argument that it, quote-unquote, creates employment. The other is that it creates wealth which would not otherwise have been produced. Both of these arguments are false because they overlook what is lost through taxation. Taxation for public housing destroys as many jobs in other lines as it creates in housing. It also results in unbuilt private homes, in unmade washing machines and refrigerators, and in lack of innumerable other commodities and services. And none of this is answered by the sort of reply which points out, for example, that public housing does not have to be financed by a lump sum capital appropriation, but merely by annual rent subsidies. This simply means that the cost to the taxpayer is spread over many years instead of being concentrated into one. Such technicalities are irrelevant to the main point. The great psychological advantage of the public housing advocates is that men are seen at work on the houses when they are going up, and the houses are seen when they are finished. People live in them and proudly show their friends through the rooms. The jobs destroyed by the taxes for the housing are not seen, nor are the goods and services that were never made. It takes a concentrated effort of thought and a new effort each time the houses and the happy people in them are seen to think of the wealth that was not created instead. It is surprising that the champions of public housing should dismiss this if it is brought to their attention as a world of imagination, as the objects of pure theory, while they point to the public housing that exists. As a character in Bernard Shaw's St. Joan replies, when told of the theory of Pythagoras that the earth is round and revolves around the sun, quote, "What an utter fool! Couldn't he use his eyes?" End quote. We must apply the same reasoning once more to great projects like the Tennessee Valley Authority. Here, because of sheer size, the danger of optical illusion is greater than ever. Here is a mighty dam, a stupendous arc of steel and concrete, quote, greater than anything that private capital could have built, end quote. The fetish of photographers, the heaven of socialists, the most often used symbol of the miracles of public construction, ownership, and operation. Here are mighty generators and powerhouses. Here is a whole region, it is said, lifted to a higher economic level, attracting factories and industries that could not otherwise have existed. And it is all presented in the panegyrics of its partisans as a net economic gain without offsets. We need not go here into the merits of the TVA or public projects like it. But this time we need a special effort of the imagination, which few people seem to be able to make, to look at the debit side of the ledger. If taxes are taken from individuals and corporations and spent in one particular section of the country, why should it cause surprise? Why should it be regarded as a miracle if that section becomes comparatively richer? Other sections of the country, we should remember, are then comparatively poorer. The thing so great that, quote-unquote, private capital could not have built it, has in fact been built by private capital, the capital that was expropriated in taxes, or if the money was borrowed, that eventually must be expropriated in taxes. Again, we must make an effort of the imagination to see the private power plants, the private homes, the typewriters and television sets that were never allowed to come into existence because of the money that was taken from people all over the country to build the photogenic Norris Dam. I have deliberately chosen the most favorable examples of public spending schemes, that is, those that are most frequently and fervently urged by the government spenders and most highly regarded by the public. I have not spoken of the hundreds of boondoggling projects that are invariably embarked upon the moment the main object is to give jobs and to put people to work. For then the usefulness of the project itself, as we have seen, inevitably becomes a subordinate consideration. Moreover, the more wasteful the work, the more costly in manpower, the better it becomes for the purpose of providing more employment. Under such circumstances, it is highly improbable that the projects thought up by the bureaucrats will provide the same net addition to wealth and welfare per dollar expended as would have been provided by the taxpayers themselves if they had been individually permitted to buy or have made what they themselves wanted instead of being forced to surrender part of their earnings to the state. All right, that concludes Chapter 4. We'll go on into the analysis and review section of the video. All right, welcome to the analysis and review part of this video, which should be fairly short because this is really just a repetition, a reapplication of the lesson that he mentioned in the first place, which is really just an extension of the broken window fallacy. And the lesson being, of course, that you need to look beyond what is immediately obvious when it comes to economic policy and when it comes to economics in general. And the extension of the broken window fallacy, which is that if you break somebody's window, then then the person whose window was broken, the shopkeep, would rather have the thing that he would have otherwise spent the money on because he obviously otherwise would have spent the money on, which again is just an extension of Smith's lesson that voluntary exchange is an indicator of what you would rather have in the case of, say, the exchange of hay for ferrying services. The farmer would rather have his horses shoed and not have the hay. So he'd rather have the ferrying services than the hay. And the farrier would rather have the hay than the time he spent ferrying the horses. And I talked about that in the first read in this book, and I've talked about that repeatedly. So I don't think we need to go into great detail on that lesson. But let's talk about just what he's looking to refute in this chapter. And the argument that he's looking to refute is fairly straightforward. He mentions the argument basically. It's a two-part argument, but he mentions it on page 34. One is the argument that government spending creates employment. The other is that it creates wealth which would not otherwise have been produced. And the simple refutation of this is on that same page. What has happened is merely that one thing has been created instead of others. So in this case, if you talk about the farmer with his oats, making the exchange to the farrier, if he has taxed a certain number of oats to build a bridge over to the farrier's house, let's say, then if he wouldn't have operated cooperatively with the local farmers to get this bridge built, obviously he would rather not have the bridge built and just ford the river with his horses to get them to the ferrying services and to get his oats over to the farrier. Maybe it's just some little babbling brook that makes no sense, that doesn't have steep embankments. It makes no sense because his horses could easily just hop right over it or walk right through the water. So this actually is kind of an extension of what I've experienced throughout my life, which is the inability of very many people to understand that opportunity costs exist and what an opportunity cost is. He basically mentions this on page 34, that to see the uncreated things required a kind of imagination that not many people have. And it's something that when you go into, say, like a town hall meeting or a local building commission, if you go into your town council meetings or however your local government set up, you'll see this happen a lot, where there isn't any cost evaluation, a cost-benefit evaluation, a reflection on the opportunity costs. What we could have spent that money on if we didn't endeavor into this project. What the taxpayers could have spent their own money on if they didn't have the money taxed. So in the case of taxes, again, he on page 33, they will have. So he was talking about building a bridge for X number of dollars. They will have that much taken away from them, which they would have otherwise spent on the things they needed most, which he goes on to explain. Therefore, for every public job created by the bridge project, a private sector job has been destroyed somewhere else. And this is not necessarily facially obvious, so he uses the best case he can for the notion that the creation of that government through taxation creates at net jobs, and that this is a good thing a priori. So in the case of dam projects, like what the Tennessee Valley Authority had, yeah, it takes a lot of money, and that money, generally speaking, has to be either saved up or pooled. So again, when it comes to the building of a dam, today, you might have seen the private sector say, yeah, there's really no money for that sort of thing to be worthwhile for me to invest in today. But if you allow me time to save my money, maybe in a few weeks, a few months, a few years, it might be worth spending that money. And when people become richer by saving, the electrical rate becomes more viable, which means that the people who are taxed a little bit to the poorer, so the middle income people in today's society, have more money to spend on other things that they might consider more material and might be more willing to save that money that they otherwise would have had to spend on taxation. And then once they have built up enough wealth, once they have gotten themselves to a position where they can afford the higher electrical rate, that's when it becomes worthwhile for the private investor to say, well, instead of getting 5 cents a kilowatt hour, I can now get 9 cents a kilowatt hour because these people would rather have the electricity than the money by that much. They would rather have the electricity than 9 cents a kilowatt hour. So in that case, and I'm using pretty low numbers by today's standards, I understand. But in that case, now it makes more sense to make that investment as the private developer. Now it makes more sense to save the money, to have saved the money in the first place. And now you have more capital to spend on that project, which will be more worthwhile to spend that money on, rather than having to, say, get a loan. Or in the case of government, what they would have to do is print more money, and what that results in is inflation, which means that private investor now has their savings, number one, discouraged, which is what they would rather do in the first place, and number two, deprecated, which means that the value of the earnings on that savings tends to decline because of the effects of inflation. Now, again, this is not going from an optics perspective. What people are going to see, let's see, I'm just reviewing my notes here. Yeah, so there's the missed opportunity to save. And what people are going to what's lost here is what's visible versus what's not quite as visible. And again, that is the opportunity to save. We see the rich guy just weaseling his money, if you will. We see the poor people struggling without electricity. And wouldn't it be nice if they had electricity? Well, yeah, but it doesn't make sense to charge them what they're willing to pay because there's just no way to have a return on that investment. Because of the existence of the already existent voluntary exchange, which is we would rather struggle and wait and build ourselves up as the poor, and the rich person would rather save his money until he has money to expend that capital without having to lose income due to the expenditure of interest on, say, a loan. What gets missed, again, is that once those jobs are created in a voluntary exchange in a significantly more economically viable manner, that company has all that money that they saved up and they're not spending, say, on interest, then they can continue to save money. Now they're doing this at a proper profit, which means that not only can they line their pockets, they can line the company's pockets. And perhaps one day it would make sense for them to expand, to open up another power plant. All of this savings gets lost if you spend the money now, if you force people in that exchange to do the thing that they wouldn't otherwise have done. So in this case, what gets lost are the creation of jobs that happen beyond that once the money is saved. We don't see the growth from the creation of jobs when the jobs are justified. And if the rates need to be subsidized, so let's say they build a dam now, and in order for it to be worthwhile, they have to charge 9 cents a kilowatt hour, but we can really only afford 5. So 4 gets basically subsidized from the government. Well, where is that coming from? That has to come from taxation. And if it's coming from just the printing of money, again, that's going to have that's going to be to the detriment of savings, which means that all that money that they could be putting, that all the net income that they could be putting in savings. Let's say in both cases they're putting in savings. In one case, they're earning a lot more than in the other. And in the case that they're earning a lot more is where there isn't that government tax to build a dam in the first place. And there isn't the subsidization happening. So if the rates need to be subsidized, all those future jobs are missed out on because I can't earn as much money even while that money is being subsidized because of the inflationary effect. Hazlitt gets into further great detail on that. I think Sowell actually presents the more cogent and understandable argument against inflationary effect in economic facts and fallacies. Again, link is in this video's description to that. So I'm not going to go into great detail on that, but the whole lesson of the chapter is basically just opportunity cost. What gets spent through taxation is just simply a shifting of what would have been spent in the public sector. And I want to be very clear, this is not an argument against taxation at all, Because if what would have been spent in the first place was that bridge, and the only way to get that money to be pooled together is through the art of taxation, then that might be a justified expense. And I would say the most clear example of this is a standing army. Because if we agree, if you imagine a small community of plane crash survivors on a desert island, and they say that, listen, we've got, I don't know, we've got wild boars, or we're on an island full of really advanced chimpanzees. And chimpanzees, as we all know, already engage in warfare. And we aren't, as humans, nearly as strong or adept in combat as chimps are if we are stripped of our clothes and all of our technology. And we're just basically fist fighting chimps. They're unbelievably strong, and they have giant teeth. And they've actually been shown to rip adult limbs right out of their socket in human beings. So incomparably strong. So let's imagine. So anytime you have these type of quantities, you should refer to the thought experiment of the desert island, the plane crash island. So 100 people. They need to have a standing army to prevent from attacks from the chimpanzees. And that's 10 people that they need, and they need to be well equipped. So the only way to get that to happen is to basically tell people, listen, if you want to be part of our society, you have to chip in 10 coconuts a week, or 10 fish a week, or whatever, in order to pay for the standing army that will protect you. And if you don't want to pay that, then out you go. Find your own island. Find your own section of the island. This island has walls. They cost money. This section of the island has a standing army that costs money. And we as a free society have decided that that's what we are going to spend the money on, with or without the existence of a formal government. So again, this isn't an argument against taxation a prioristically. It's just an argument against the notion that taxation should be used to create jobs. Because the creation of jobs through taxation is merely the misprioritizing of that expenditures if those jobs wouldn't have happened anyways, in which case, if they're going to happen anyways, why have the taxation? So that's the point of the lesson that I think Hazlitt is conveying in chapter 4. He's absolutely spot on. We're a little bit short here today, so which is kind of cool because I'm trying to keep these lessons and the analysis and review pretty short. He does mention the river between, and we did a geography lesson with our last read with Sowell, so let's do a brief geography lesson with Hazlitt. He mentions a river between Easton and Weston. It turns out that I actually live in Connecticut, and I live very close to Easton and Weston. I know exactly where these two towns are. It turns out Henry Hazlitt lived in a huge part of his adulthood in Connecticut, in Fairfield, Connecticut, which is on the border of, I think, both Easton and Weston, who actually border each other. Easton is east of Weston, and there is a river that runs between their borders. It's the Aspetuck River. It eventually flows into the Saugatuck River, which eventually flows into the Long Island Sound. So that's actually a real thing. I have no idea if he's referring specifically to a bridge. I think he is using the concept of an Easton and a Weston, not in the specific, but in the generic, in that sense. But it's true that he probably knew of these two towns actually existing in real life. So that should conclude everything that we need to get out of this chapter. So until the next time, this has been Mike, signing off.